year. We're going to be talking about the comparative orders. What does that mean? We're going to be comparing orders roughly between Greek and Roman architecture. And by that, I mean, we're going to be talking about how they're arranged and designed with several different famous architects. But for the most part, if you're new to the class, we earlier talked about the difference between the 5 classical orders which are established: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. The 3 main orders are Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Then, of course, if you remember, Tuscan was introduced during the Romans, and then Composite was added later during the Renaissance. So really specifically, a lot of people have been asking me, what is the main difference between Greek orders and Roman orders? Let's kind of look at this chart carefully. Well, actually, before I go further, I was going to show you, then we're going to talk about how the classical orders are arranged and designed by really these 4 or 5 prominent architects: Palladio, Inigo Jones, Michelangelo, Legends, my favorite, and of course, Christopher Wren. The dates on the boards are really the dates where they were the most prolific. These are not the birth dates. And also, I don't have a lot of terms in this lecture because we went over many terms and information in the lectures before this. So we're really just going to be looking and observing the way the classical language is relative to Greek and Roman orders, then of course how they're applied and used with these several architects. And I'll give you a few minutes to write these down in your sketchbooks. Actually, I can come back to this. Let's kind of look at, there's some very subtle differences between Greek and Roman orders. A lot of people think that they're the same. There's definitely some very slight inflections or differences. If you look at the Greek Doric order on the left, is that the Roman Doric order, you can see that the Greek columns are relatively fatter than, of course, Roman. Remember from our earlier lectures is that by the time the Romans came into being, is that they were able to maximize the structural depth and width and minimize the material. Of course, the Doric order is fluted in both conditions, Greek and Roman, and of course we both have the capital, but the Greek Doric column on the left does not have a base. It's just the flutes die into the actual platform, or what's called the stylobate, the very base of the temple or the building. If you look at Roman Greek, there is of course a capital, and then there's a very slight little, very subtle base that's carved at the very bottom. Then I'll give you some examples in a minute. So, obviously, you can see the Greek columnar order is a little bit very different of the Roman order. We'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, the same thing with Corinthian, and of course, we'll talk about Tuscan later. But for the most part, you have to remember that the Doric order does show the triglyphs and the metopes on the Frisian tablature, which we talked about earlier. So we talked about this, is that the way you properly proportion the orders is really based on each diameter. So each order has its own height based on the diameter of the column, especially every little detail in the moldings and everything that sort of creates this classical order. So remember that the Doric order does show the triglyphs and the metopes on the frieze. Of course, Ionic and Corinthian and Composite leave those out. Here's a little bit more of a clear diagram of the relationship of some of the Greek temples and some of the Roman temples. So for the most part, you can definitely see that the language of architecture, the detail is, there's some infinite little variations between Greek and Roman orders. Okay, obviously this is Greek Doric because of course the columns are fluted. There's a simple cap and what's called the square tablet between the architrave, which you talked about earlier, and of course the capital is called the abacus. So again, the Doric order does not have the base in Greece. Let's go back to this one. So the Greek order does not have a base. The Doric orders, the Roman Doric order has, of course, a carved base in it. So let's take a look at Greek Ionic versus Roman Ionic. I think for the most part, For people that really don't understand, or they aren't trained in observing and understanding the orders, is that the Greek Ionic has some very subtle differences between Greek and Roman architecture. Let's take a look at this image, especially this one. If you go back to our earlier moldings discussion, is that there's an egg and dart mold in between what's called the volutes, or the scrolls. Now, if you can see my cursor, is that the swag is, of course, is curvilinear between each one of the scrolls. You can see that this is clearly Greek Ionic order. So carefully, in the Roman Ionic order, is that they're flat. Remember, these are curvilinear. The swags between the two volutes are curved. But in the Roman order, they're flat. And of course, you can see that the egg and dart mold is more clearly prominent. And this, of course, it projects much further. It's an interesting subtle variation between, because you can clearly see this is great because we have different flowers, and of course the top of the capital, or between the capital and the shaft, and of course the volutes are a little bit more accentuated and larger. So the Romans made, of course, the volutes smaller, and the egg and dart molded between that much larger. So let's look at Greek and Roman Corinthian capitals. So the one on the left is, of course, the Greek capital. There's some very subtle differences, not really that prominent to the naked eye, but for the most part, the space between the two tendrils, of course, the ones above the canthal seats, they interlock each other. It's a very Grecian motif, is to have the tendrils interlock each other. And of course, the canthales are much larger and pronounced in Greek Corinthian order. Then in the Roman order on the right, we can see that the canthales are a little bit more carefully designed and contained. Then, of course, the two tendrils touch each other. They do not overlap each other. It's interesting to see that the very subtle differences between Greek and Roman orders are somewhat evident here. Here's a photograph of what I'm talking about. Is that it's interesting to see the dialogue of the drawing and, of course, the sculpture. Of course, this wonderful sculptor in ancient Greece, Callimachus, created this. So you can definitely see the specific difference between the two orders, Greek and of course, Roman capitals. Again, what I was saying earlier is that it's remarkable to see that these are carved out of one solid block of stone or marble. So then, of course, I like to show engravings and drawings of what these capitals actually look like. If you look at the center of these, especially this one, the Greek Ionic order, the scrolls are very much carefully done, and they're more accentuated and larger than you see Roman Dorics. If you look at the image on the right, where my cursor is, you can see that the Greek Ionic order, the Ionics, the volutes are much larger, and of course the swag is curving and hanging down above the egg and dart mold. Of course, the Roman one below that straightens it out. So it's interesting to see the relationship of the Greek orders versus the Roman orders in these. Okay, so those really are three main differences between Greek and Roman architecture. It's based on the difference of the base, and of course the variations in the capitals. And then, of course, I've already discussed the nature of the height and the dimensions of the columns in our earlier lectures, if you're just now attending. Okay, so we're going to start looking at how these orders are varied and applied to primarily the facades of these really great Renaissance and neoclassical architects. First, we're going to talk about Michelangelo, 1560. This is, of course, not the year he's born, but this is the year he was most prolific. Let's look at the facades of the Capitoline Hill. So what he's doing is, in my earlier lecture, I did mention that Michelangelo did kind of invert things and flip things over. And by that, I mean is that what he did was he took the classical courses of the Corinthian order, he actually bypassed all the floors with what's called the giant order in architecture. So in other words, normally you would see the columnar orders in these horizontal registers, which I'll show you in a minute. But for the most part, Michelangelo breaks the floor plates with these enormous Corinthian capitals and orders, because of course the Corinthian columns are proportioned based on the entire wall, not just the individual floors. And what I was saying is normally on the ground floor, those are Tuscan or Doric, but he flips things over and makes the ground floor the Ionic order. And of course, the ones above that are the Corinthian order. The very, very intense three-dimensional language of architecture. Of course, Michelangelo started as a sculptor and became an architect. But you can see his three-dimensional quality definitely comes through from the beginnings of his being a sculptor. So let's take a look at his very famous Laurentian library. Here's the main staircase. It has something very interesting with the classical language of order, especially the entablatures. I'll kind of flip through these slides and just quickly to show you the entire enclosure of the space. A very interesting yet strange language of facades and columns superimposed in the thickness of the wall. And notice how original and unique the classical order is. This is technically the Doric order, but of course he's, he's kind of inverting and changing up the original Greek and classical orders, because of course he's creating his own sort of mannerist vocabulary. A very dramatic work. I'll talk about the specifics in a minute. Let's kind of go back to this for a minute. Let's go back to the language of the entablature. Now, there are some really specific rules, as I mentioned earlier, about the height of the entablature to each one of these orders is really specific and very based on, of course, the dimension of the columns and the height and everything. So notice how the cornice, the entire entablature, of course, which incorporates the architrave frieze, the cornice is a very thick and substantial member, of course, because it is the structure of the building above that. The columns are holding up the structure. But so let's take a look at what Michelangelo does with the language of the entablature in the Lateran Library. It's interesting that he kind of leaves it out. If you look at this normally, if you can see where the columns are, this would be an entirely full designed cornice and entablature based on languages we just discussed, but he's kind of changing them because Michelangelo was a very original, imaginative thinker. It's really interesting to see that the language is sort of changed because, he's making an argument. We've already seen the classical orders in classical and Roman architecture pretty much reinstated for thousands of years. So he's deciding to kind of change that in his own sort of language of what facades can look like if you don't exactly follow the exact formula. But of course, there are canons or formulas of proportion, which we've seen, and of course, the language of the tapering columns, the dimensions, the language of the diameter column determines the height of the columns. But what's interesting here in the Lateran Library is quite a bit different than we've seen in Renaissance, in Renaissance and Greek and classical architecture, because the columns are embedded into the wall. There is a special space for the column. We really haven't seen this before. And Michelangelo, of course, was a classical genius designing in a Renaissance idiom. If you look at some of the details carefully, is that what he's doing is he's taking normally the tapering in the column you can see in the round, I'm calling the Doric order that he's sort of reinventing, is that the tapering is from the bottom to the top. But if you look at the little edicules, of course, the little temples in between the columns, is that the tapering is the opposite, it's inverted. So it's really interesting to see him changing the language of the proper tapering, and of course, in his own vocabulary. What's also interesting is a kind of a modern detail is that the fact that the central panel has no decoration, no what I'm calling attic or window. It's the smooth surface, because of course he is celebrating the wall surface, and he's designing a special space just for the columns. Very original, very inventive, but still extraordinarily beautiful, even if we don't have the entablature carved and properly proportioned above the columns. It's a very unique, a very original way to start kind of changing the language of the classical, what I'm saying, formula, because architecture relatively was formulaic before Michelangelo came into being. So what I'm saying is that if you look at the Colosseum, Really, the formula was this: in the ground floor, you would have the Tuscan or Doric columns in the ground floor. You would have the Ionic columns. Then, of course, you have the Corinthian order. So pretty much there's three formulas that would stack on top of each other. So really, this is, of course, Roman architecture in the 1st century AD. So, 1400 years later, Michelangelo decides to start getting busy at the drawing table and starts reinventing and creating kind of a very original language. And this is just a magnificent collision of his flat pilasters relative to the round columns. It's interesting to see that the volutes here actually are not full volutes. They interrupt each other and collide. So very difficult as a layperson or a sculptor to actually carve these things out in this sort of language. Again, normally if we look at the what I'm calling these little ediculas, of course, it's a building within a building, these little pediments with the columns, that normally the fluting, if we've seen in Doric or Greek, Doric, and Roman architecture, the flutes continue all the way up through the entire column. He's doing something very different in that the fluting is simply a detail, not the entire length of the column. Of course, Michelangelo certainly did not carve all these out himself. He had a plethora of artists and craftsmanship to pull these things off. I just thought that was such a wonderful break from the kind of, what I'm saying, formulaic Greek and Roman architecture in, of course, before or after, right after the 1st century architecture. So that's roughly Michelangelo's work. These are just parts of his project. I like to show look at the plan of the Lorenzo Library. Of course, the stair is the most important focal piece in this space, but the plan is extraordinary because you can see the column's thicknesses relative to the thickness of the wall. So these are these little arch pediments, which of course are superimposed with the language of the columns. A beautiful drawing of the wall thickness. So what I mean, by a lot of sort of a playful language is the Porta Pia is actually a gateway, not really a building. But what Michelangelo does with the columnar orders in ancient Greece is he is very original and flipped things upside down and has a very sort of bizarre language of the pilasters at the tower versus, of course, the fluted Doric columns, which are pilasters at the entry colonnade. Of course, he does some very expansive things. He takes the volutes from the Ionic capital and has a very large festoon in between the two curls. This is an older photograph. The best way to experience facades in architecture is it's seeing in its best light. You can definitely see that the sunlight really intensifies the three-dimensional quality of Michelangelo's work. Of course, these are, Google research is a great tool. They have some beautiful images on Pinterest and Google, but you can definitely see the kind of exaggerated language of classical architecture kind of turned on its ear. So a lot of people think that, Michelangelo is this kind of tired Renaissance architect, but definitely not, because if people don't understand his, his sort of inventive nature, because look how tiny the little shafts of the column, he could have left those out, but of course he's emphatic with the articulation of things. Especially the way he sort of warps the classical cornice. Normally these are square and perpendicular or curved as a concave element, but what he's doing is he's sort of intensifying the language of the original classical orders, just in a very few details. Okay, so let's take a look at Plato's work. Again, this is not the birth date, this is 1500, probably the prime of his work. What we're going to show you is Plato's work, of course, is borrowing from Michelangelo and then, of course, the Greek and Roman orders. So what he's doing is he's establishing the language of the Doric orders on the ground floor, and of course, the Ionic is on the second floor. So what he's doing is something very original. This is probably the first time that we've seen paired columns. In Greek architecture, you would just see the columns equally spaced roughly between each one of what I'm calling the architrave. We've talked about it. It's at the main beam above the columns. So Plato does something very original here. At the end of the bay, the central bay, he pairs the columns together as a way of giving more emphasis into the central panel. So we really haven't seen a paired column relationship before this because they're all relatively equally spaced. So Palladio does something very unique in this order. Of course, we can clearly see that the Doric order shows the triglyphs and the metopes and the frieze, and of course the entablature. Then, of course, in the Ionic order, you don't need to show that, so it's completely smooth. So here's a detail of one of the corners. Very interesting, the fact that, this is a Roman on it because, of course, the swags are flat, and of course, the Ionic columns are the volutes are much smaller. But very carefully, the way that he turns the Ionic volute into a 45-degree angle. This is the only column in this entire building where the corners are articulated as a 45-degree angle. It's a very interesting visual relationship. And of course, instead of continuing the columns above that, we have these finials with sculptures and figures at the top as a way of kind of terminating the top of the building as it punctures the sky. So here's, of course, Basilica Vicendi. If you remember our lecture earlier, is that Palladio borrowed what's called the Cerulean art. Sebastian Cerulean was really one of the first architects next to Vitruvius that sort of canonized all the classical orders in one language. We've seen the 5 orders. But so what he's doing, he's taking Sebastian Cerulean's arch, which means the large central panel with the curve, and of course the side flanking, what I'm calling the rectangular openings, of course, with the curves. So again, he's still doing the same thing he did at Palazzo Chiricati, is that the ground floor has normally the Tuscan or Doric order with, of course, the triglyphs and metopes, and then, of course, the second layer is really the Ionic order. If there was a third layer, you would be seeing Corinthian, because we've seen the Colosseum in the ancient Greek and Roman architecture is that the classical orders fit into a language or horizontal register of Doric, Ionic, and of course Corinthian. So just a very wonderful play of small, large, and delicate columns in one facade. So this is Inigo Jones, roughly 16. He did a lot of the royal palaces, a lot of the buildings for the royal family. One of his earlier projects is, of course, called Covent Garden, but it's a very simple, he's kind of sort of basing this off of the early Etruscan temple. This, of course, is the Roman Doric, because Roman Doric has the curved base, and of course the simple or the masculine order with the capitals. He does something really interesting because Vitruvius, the first century architect, if you remember from my earlier lectures, is that he said that the architrave, of course, which is the horizontal beam that spans between each one of the columns, this is loosely termed as the lintel or the header, is that more than 2 or 3 of these columns in terms of diameter would cause structural failure. But I'm not sure how Inigo Jones is able to span. I'm sure these are probably large pieces of stone that span from one column to another. But what I was saying in the earlier lecture is there are wonderful contradictions in architecture, because Vitruvius said that, more than 2 or 3 columns, it would cause a structural failure between, of course, the span between the different columns. But of course, we've seen that structurally you can span much further than that. So when you look at architecture, there's a lot of rules that are established, but a lot of these people violate the rules, possibly to see what they can get away with, just based on aesthetics and proportions. But also, what's looking like a wooden roof or temple is simply just a stone edifice that is really decorative, not the structure. But if you look at this, look how thin the stone shelf is underneath the pediment. So we have a kind of a masculine order at the base with the columns, and of course, a very thin, delicate roof above that. So here is the banqueting house, of course, by Inigo Jones. He does introduce the classical language as decorative elements on facade. What I was saying earlier is that in Roman architecture, the columnar orders on the facades are not structural, these are decorative. So Inigo Jones is kind of reinstating the classical orders as decorative elements. Of course, we've seen that in the Colosseum, is that, of course, in Greek architecture, the columns are structural. Now in Roman architecture, they are decorative. Of course, they articulate the facade, they give it a scale, they give it a 3-dimensional quality, they give it shades and shadows. But it's quite a bit different than Michelangelo, because in this one, he is carefully constructing the language of the classical orders, the dimensions of the columns, the height of things, so on and so forth. And also he does something very inventive with, of course, what's called the pediments, interlocking, interchanging, curved, impedimented arches above each one of the windows. So then let's talk about one of his other houses. It's called the Chiswick House in England. But it's interesting because on this one, we're not seeing, he could have easily applied the columnar orders onto the facade, but he's doing something what I'm saying, something modern is that look how simple and clean the wall surface is without any sort of profiles or moldings or decoration or classical orders. The only time we see the orders is, of course, what's called the Cerulean or the Palladian art. So again, Inigo Jones is stealing from Plato. Of course, Plato is stealing from Serlio as, of course, this language of what's called the arched window, of course, with the two rectangular sidelights. But it's a brilliant sort of break from looking at every facade being decorated with all the columnar orders. So this is a very original work that we've sort of hinted at in Michelangelo's Laurentian library, because of course we're not seeing moldings and profiles on every surface. So it's really wonderful to see the smooth, unadorned facade with just the details and moldings, just simply parts of it. But look how wonderful the shadow is just on the arched niche with the urn inside of that, any sort of detail. Of course, the classical entablature, which of course is the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice, is of course a very delicately articulated element. So later, we get into Christopher in 1700. Relatively, I want to say, I guess we could consider him. It's really a neoclassical. He's definitely, of course, both classical and neoclassical. But what he's doing is on the facade, something very, interesting is that, of course, he has two Corinthian orders for the base and, of course, the second floor. Normally, we would be looking at Tuscan or Doric, but Christopher Wren has already seen the language of classical architecture in those horizontal registers. He's changing that because this is such an extraordinary cathedral. I think he's making a level of hierarchy, as that all the entire orders in the facades are the prominent, of course, the most decorative, the Corinthian order. So it's wonderful to see the Corinthian order is pretty much one language on all the facades. The only time that he changes that is, of course, the Doric order on the drum of the dome or on the cathedral. And also he does something, of course, very unique, is that we're seeing paired Corinthian columns. You really wouldn't see paired columns in Greek and Roman architecture. It's really up to the Renaissance and neoclassical architects to do that. Okay, so let's see, these are some other elevations he did. This is Hampton Court Palace. So what he's doing is he's mixing the brick language of architecture, of course, with the cut stone. But notice how thin and elegant and delicate the Corinthian order is. There's really only one order at the central panel. So he could have easily just borrowed from the language of architecture and orders from the Colosseum, which let me show that to you. He could have easily done this, but of course he is introducing something very original. He has the classical order is just in one central panel. So the main salon, the central or the piano nobile is, of course, is heavily articulated with the Corinthian order. Of course, it sits very heavily on a rusticated base. Of course, the rustication are the stone banding that don't have the classical orders on it. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit later Edwin Legends' work in 1900. I'm not sure exactly which building this one is, but he does some really wonderful, playful languages with different columnar orders, especially the way he mixes the arches, of course, with the classical orders. And it's interesting that if you look at the second story openings, is that there's an arch at the top, and of course there's an arch at the bottom. So he flips things over like Michelangelo does. He inverts the arch and makes it a window sill, which is very original. Of course, he's layering many different colors. But also, it's interesting, look at what's called, earlier I talked about the span of the architectural openings called the voussoirs, the diagonal stones that structurally span the openings. Really, the voussoirs are really larger than really intended to be structural, but of course he's making these sort of architectural puns and exaggerating some of the languages. But he does some really magnificent work with the language of the way the facades are incorporated with the columns. You know, this is probably the composite order, but for the most part, the ground floor has no columnar order. It's simply the heavy masonry base. Then, of course, the columns are all made of masonry and bricks, not cut stone. So it's interesting to see that the entablature is very exaggerated and heavily emphasized by the nature of the two different materials. You know, a lot of architects think that, you know, what I'm saying is, you know, these columns are really not structural, they are decorative, but these definitely are the structure of the building. So Christopher Wren's portico is structural. There's probably iron bars in that. Of course, this is way before steel, but there are cases in classical, neoclassical architecture where the columns are structural, not just the intricacies. Of course, these are not structural, they're decorative. But it's interesting to see the way that all these really famous architects take the language and sort of invent themselves as their own kind of original language, especially with Michelangelo. He's definitely the most original classical architecture. Of course, then, of course, later we have Christopher Wren and, of course, Edwin Legends to kind of make these sort of visual playful changes. And of course, the way the arch tympanum reads, of course, with the central panel. Okay, so I think it's about 12:30. I think we can open this discussion up for questions and comments. I'd like you to make sure you make a note of these architects we talked about. I'm sure you've probably written the orders in your sketchbook probably before, but I just want to make sure that these are some very important architects that sort of, I don't want to say of course they did change things, but they took the original language and they sort of reinvented it in a very intellectual and somewhat playful manner. So then I think you can probably type in your questions in the chat box, and I think Michelle, you can probably, I'm not able to see the chat box in my Teams meeting, but does anyone have any questions so far about anything?
There are no questions at this moment in the chat box.
Okay. And then I can go back and then pause some of the images if you want to either ask some questions or write some notes in your sketchbook. You know, if you look at the difference between Greek and Roman, they're very subtle differences. It's really based on the very delicacy of the capitals and, of course, the base.
Jay, there's still no questions or anything in the chat. Oh, I lied. Hold on. It just loaded.
Okay.
Like as I was saying that, it came in.
Yeah, I'm sure someone has a question. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Margaret has said, I'm interested in learning more about the window hoods on the banqueting house in London and the Palazzo, I'm going to mispronounce this.
Girardi.
Thank you. There are alternating triangular and domed window hoods. Is there any more background on that?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question because I think to get away from the facades of being boring, it'd be very severe if every opening had the same sort of detail. So I think there was probably some ruins in Pompeii where some of the facades had these alternating curved and triangular pediments. But since it was covered with a volcano and rediscovered in the 1700s, is that the Renaissance architects probably thought that they originated the alternating pediments. But I think when they started excavating the ruins, they could see fragments that the ancient Pompeians probably already started doing the alternating pediments. And of course, Michelangelo did that as well too. I think I have, let me see if I can have a slide of that. Yeah, to answer your question, it's a very common classical motif to alternate the curve and the triangle. I'm not sure there's that much historical information, but yeah, I hope that, does that answer your question?
Okay, there's another question. Oh, Margaret said yes, that answered her question. There's also a question from Bob that says, how did classical architects decide on the column diameter, 24 inches, 30 inches, 36 inches, etc.? Was it a structural decision or just visual?
I guess to answer that, let's kind of go back to this chart. I think I think I might be repeating myself, but you're saying how do they determine the diameter?
Yes. How did they decide on the diameter? Was it a structural decision or was it just for a visual decision?
Well, I think it's definitely both, because if you look at this, is that what I was saying is the Greek structure and order that was really the structure of the building. So the Roman orders were decorative. So what happened is in Greek architecture, they would discuss the engineering attributes of having what size of a diameter of column you would need to hold up an entire entablature. It's not really based on 24, 36, or 48 inches. It's really based on the height, because it's proportion. That what you would do is you would start with the height of the frieze. Let me see if I can go to another image. Like on this one, you would take the height and you would use this chart to figure out the proper dimension of course, the columns. But this chart is showing you that the thickness of the column is really based on the height. In other words, like if you look at Tuscan order, you would be using 7 diameters for the height. Of course, whatever diameter that is, you would have to divide the height, of course, with however many diameters that is. So it's really not based on, it's not based on 24, 36 inches. It's really based on really the proportions. So in Greek architecture, it's really based on the structural dimensions. Then in Roman architecture, they would use that formula and use, of course, decorative columns. Let me see if I can find that. So they're still using the proper ratio of the thickness of the columns and the height. Of course, in Roman, these are decorative. But I'm not sure if that answered your question. Did that help you at all, or? I guess, in other words, you would never say, well, the column here is 24 inches in diameter. So then you're going to build a building based on, you can do that, whatever, if the diameter is 24 inches, how tall would 24 inches be times 7 diameters? You'd have to multiply that. So, yeah, did that make any sense, or?
I'm waiting to see if he responds in the chat or not.
Okay, those are good questions. It is a lot of information to decipher and understand. Hopefully, if you've been taking the classes sequentially, that the classes kind of build upon each other.
Yeah, so there is a comment from Bobby, I can't see the last name there. As we look at designing and building in the classical style today, how do we draw the line between what is done, quote unquote, correctly versus breaking the mold and shaking things up, as we've seen in a few examples today? And then Bob, from the original question, said that yes, the height comes first, structural considerations are secondary. So he understood what you were explaining.
Okay, good, yeah. To answer that, the last question is that before you go and sort of break out of the envelope, you really need to understand how these things are really created and properly designed. What I was saying is, the American Vignola, which is written by William Ware, is a very simple, I hate to say the word formula, but a very template to follow to properly understand how these things are drawn in proportion. And then, of course, let's take a look at the architects we just taught. These are extremely brilliant and inventive people. What they're doing is, we haven't seen, in Michelangelo, is, of course, creating what's called the giant order, which was very original. So I think it's hard for, I guess, to answer a question, is that I would study the very foundations of these orders first before you start making sort of, aesthetic changes. It's easy to get way off course, but of course, we've seen that hundreds or thousands of architects, over thousands of years have been taking these orders and saying, we've already seen this done 1,000 times. I think I'm capable of maybe ad-libbing and incorporating some of my own original aesthetic. So you're welcome to do that. I would just say, make sure that you understand how these are created first before you just kind of start flipping the columns upside down and exaggerating the volutes. Because what we've seen, I think I've shown you some contemporary classical architecture where they don't understand the orders and they produce these very horrible, disastrous results. Like specifically, let me take a look at it. Can you guys see my cursor? Well, I guess what I'm saying is, one main violation not to do is the entablature is always aligned with the neck of the column, always in every order. So when I see somebody projecting this thing further, is that it just looks like you have no idea what you don't understand the language, and it looks visibly terrible. It looks like you don't really understand the language of the column, because this is really where the structural beam would end. Because cantilevering this out would be a classical like. There's really no such thing as a cantilever in classical architecture, except for where it's corbelled out with a bracket. Now, this is not really it's a projection, but what I'm saying is, to project out the structural member would be a structural and classical like. You would never do that. So I've just seen a lot of contemporary architects where they try to do that, and it looks like a blatant mistake. But, again, what I'm saying is, there's wonderful contradictions and paradoxes, because, Michelangelo is not copying the Doric order. This is quite far different than what we've seen earlier. The language of, because, of course, the round band between the capital and the shaft is much lower. I don't know why, but he is Michelangelo and can get away with this beautifully, because he's already designed in the early formula. So what I'm saying is, classical architecture before Michelangelo was formulaic. So I hope that kind of answers your questions. It's a little bit frustrating to look. It's like, oh my gosh, this is just a blatant mistake, because there's no frieze, there's no cornice. I mean, how does Michelangelo get away with doing that? But it's really kind of a difficult question to answer. But I'm answering this as a designer, not a historian. But as a designer, I make sure you carefully understand how these things are properly proportioned and spaced.
Bobby said thank you.
Okay, sure. I just think that the language of classical, especially the Portopoeia, is extremely playful and, quite a little bit far out of the original classical form that we've seen before. And let me go back to these, like Palladio, of course, he was, as brilliant as he was just doing some very subtle, visual differences that you would really never see a paired column in ancient Greek or Roman architecture. They're paired, of course, these are Renaissance. So this is a very unique way of kind of changing up the sort of status quo of classical architecture. Well, I think we have about 10 more minutes, so there's only 4 or 5 students in the class.
No, we had other people join us. We have 10 participants in addition to you and I. So you and me. Yeah.
I'm happy to go back and show some the images if you're behind on things. Especially the subtle difference between Greek, Ionic, and Roman. I mean, you can definitely see the difference between the orders. Is that it's interesting that the main difference is they made the volute smaller, and of course the egg and dart more pronounced, and of course the fact that these are flat.
So I'm not seeing any other comments in the chat at this point.
Okay. I guess just, my favorite is what Edwin Legends does with the language of classical. He's not, well, we're entering a phase of what's called early modern architecture. Of course, he's not doing that, but just his work alone is just exquisite. These are just a few images that he's done. I just thought that the way he kind of changes the language of arches, and of course everything is very original and inventive. And if you want me to go back to one of the images, I'm happy to do that.
There's no other comments in the chat, so I don't know if you want to end a little bit early today. It's 12:52 right now.
Okay. Yeah. What other comments?
We got a comment from Hill Swift saying, thank you for the illustrative discussion of these buildings and spaces.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of information to cover. This is a very complex language of architecture. So.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have about 7 more minutes. Okay, well, Michelle, I guess.
Yeah, there's actually 2 comments that came in. One is from Margaret saying it would be nice to get a PDF of the comparison images that you have in your presentation, which you can send that to Valerie or myself so we can email it out today, or that's
Okay.
important, correct?
Yeah, I can. And
then there's another comment, and I can't read the name, it's really shortened, that says, thanks for the commentary on the Laurentine Library.
Okay.
And that's it. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, so for our next lecture on next Tuesday, and I will see you guys next week then.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you, everybody. Bye.